September 12th, 1946, Madison Square Garden, New York City. The lights are blazing, the crowd is electric, 20,000 Americans jammed shoulder to shoulder, waving signs and chanting for peace. Henry Wallace, once Franklin D. Roosevelt's right-hand man, steps up to the microphone. He's tall, lanky, with that Iowa farm boy earnestness that made him a New Deal legend. As FDR's vice president from 1941 to 1945, he'd helped feed a starving nation during the Depression and rallied the world against fascism. Now, as Truman's Secretary of Commerce, he's about to light a fuse that will blow up his career and expose the fault lines cracking America's post-war dreams. The danger of war is much less from communism than it is from imperialism. Whether it be of the United States or England, Wallace booms, his voice cutting through the roar. The tough attitude of the United States, the harder we get, the tougher the Russians will get. The arena explodes in applause. These folks, progressives, union workers, peace activists, are tired of war. They've just beaten Hitler and Tojo. Now Truman's talking tough on Stalin. Wallace is their hero, insisting cooperation with the Soviets is the way to avoid World War III. He's channeling FDR's vision of a united world where America and Russia build peace together. But across the Atlantic, Secretary of State James Burns is in Paris, locked in tense talks with Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov over Europe's future. Wallace's words, they're like a backstab, undermining America's position, suggesting we'd roll over on Eastern Europe. Truman, who glanced at the speech draft and nodded it through without a fine-tooth comb, wakes up to a PR nightmare. He issues a statement. Wallace speaks for himself, not the U.S. government. 2 weeks later, on September 20th, Truman calls Wallace into the Oval Office and asks for his resignation. Wallace is out. But instead of retreating to his New York farm, he declares war on Truman's presidency. For the next 2 years, through fiery speeches, magazine articles, and a quixotic 1948 third-party run, Wallace becomes the voice of dissent against the emerging Cold War. Wallace believed he was saving humanity from nuclear doom. He saw himself as FDR's true heir, fighting for progressive ideals against a bellicose machine politician from Missouri. He was sincere, innovative, and deeply committed. But as events unfolded, from the Soviet takeover of Czechoslovakia to the North Korean invasion, he was also profoundly, tragically wrong. This is the full, unvarnished story of Henry Wallace, the visionary who helped invent modern American agriculture, the vice president dumped in a smoky Chicago convention hall, the crusader who challenged Truman's containment doctrine, and the idealist whose blind spots nearly derailed the free world. It's a saga of political ambition, ideological fervor, and the harsh lessons of totalitarian power. We'll dive into the drama, the decisions, and the what-ifs, because understanding Wallace's fall isn't just history. It's a masterclass in why good intentions aren't always enough when facing down dictators. Grab your coffee, America. This is going to be a ride. We'll explore how Wallace rose to power, how he lost it all, and why history judges him as a cautionary tale. And along the way, we'll see how Truman, the underestimated everyman, became one of our greatest presidents. Let's start at the beginning. The heir apparent, Wallace's rise from Iowa fields to the White House. To grasp why Wallace's downfall hit so hard, you have to appreciate his meteoric rise. This wasn't some silver-spoon politician. This was a self-made intellectual who blended science, faith, and reform to change America. Henry Wallace, the farm boy genius. Born October 7, 1888 in Orient, Iowa, Henry Wallace grew up in a family of agricultural influencers. His grandfather, Uncle Henry Wallace, founded Wallace's Farmer, a magazine that became the Bible for Midwestern growers. His father, Henry Wallace, served as Secretary of Agriculture under Presidents Harding and Coolidge. Young Henry was a prodigy. At Iowa State College, he studied plant breeding, experimenting with corn hybrids in the family fields. By his 20s, he'd developed high-yield strains that boosted U.S. corn production by billions of bushels, feeding armies in Guadalupe and civilians in the Depression. Imagine that. One man's tinkering helped make America the breadbasket of the world. But Wallace wasn't just a scientist. He was a mystic and a moralist. Influenced by theosophy and Native American spirituality, he believed in a democratic, ever-normal granary for society, using government to ensure fairness. He was progressive before it was cool, advocating for civil rights, women's equality, and internationalism. As editor of Wallace's Farmer, he railed against Wall Street speculators and supported farmers' cooperatives. When the Great Depression hit, Wallace's ideas found a home in FDR's brain trust. Roosevelt saw in him a kindred spirit, a reformer who could fix rural America. Wallace and the New Deal, revolutionizing American agriculture, appointed Secretary of Agriculture. In 1933, Wallace hit the ground running. The Dust Bowl was ravaging the plains, farms were foreclosing, and food prices were in freefall. Wallace's solutions were bold and controversial. The Agricultural Adjustment Act, AAA, paid farmers to reduce crops, stabilizing prices. Critics called it plowing under pigs, but it saved family farms. Soil Conservation Service planted millions of trees, built terraces, and rotated crops, preventing another Dust Bowl. Today, it's why the Midwest still feeds the nation. Farm Security Administration, loans for tenant farmers, rural electrification, and resettlement programs. Iconic photos by Dorothea Lange captured the human impact. Food stamp program piloted in 1939, it evolved into SNAP, helping millions avoid hunger. Wallace wasn't afraid to experiment. He pushed for hybrid seeds, vitamin-enriched foods, and even international food aid. By 1940, he'd turned agriculture from a crisis sector into a powerhouse. Liberals loved him. Conservatives saw him as a socialist meddler. But FDR, he called Wallace the best Secretary of Agriculture we've ever had. Wallace's personal style was quirky. He practiced yoga, consulted astrologers, and wrote letters to gurus. But his intellect was razor-sharp, earning respect even from foes. The 1940 vice presidential pick, a bold gamble. As World War II loomed, FDR sought a third term, his VP choice Wallace over more conventional picks like John Nance Garner. Party bosses balked. Wallace was too liberal, too intellectual, a crackpot with his mystical leanings. At the 1940 Democratic Convention in Chicago, Eleanor Roosevelt herself rallied delegates for Wallace. FDR threatened to bolt if they rejected him. Wallace won the nomination, and the ticket crushed Willkie. As vice president from January 1941, Wallace was no ceremonial figure. He chaired the Board of Economic Warfare, overseeing Lend-Lease aid to allies. He traveled to Latin America and Siberia, forging ties. His May 8, 1942 speech, "The Century of the Common Man," became legendary. This is a fight between a slave world and a free world. The century on which we are entering, the century which will come out of this war, can be and must be the century of the common man. It was a counter to Henry Luce's American century, emphasizing global democracy over U.S. dominance. Wallace envisioned a post-war world of shared prosperity, with the U.S. and USSR as partners. Wallace's Soviet optimism, ally or illusion. Central to Wallace's worldview was his take on the Soviet Union. During World War II, Stalin was Uncle Joe, the ally whose Red Army bled Hitler dry at Stalingrad. Wallace visited Siberia in 1944, praising Soviet progress, though he missed the gulags. He saw the USSR as a bulwark against fascism, an experiment in worker empowerment despite flaws, a potential partner for peace if treated with respect, responsive to cooperation, not confrontation. This wasn't unique. Many Americans, from Hollywood to Harvard, shared the sentiment. The Yalta Conference, 1945, promised collaboration. But Wallace's faith ran deeper, rooted in his belief that misunderstandings caused conflicts and goodwill could bridge them. As we'll see, this optimism would be his Achilles heel. The 1944 Democratic Convention, backroom deals, and a fateful snub. July 19th to 21st, 1944, Chicago Stadium, the air thick with cigar smoke, delegates sweating in the summer heat. FDR is running for a fourth term, but his frailty is whispered about. The VP slot? It's not just a ticket balancer. It's likely the next president. Wallace's case for re-nomination. Wallace had the grassroots. Polls showed 65% of Democrats favored him. Labor unions, African Americans. He'd pushed for anti-lynching laws, and liberals rallied. FDR privately told Wallace, "I hope it's the same team again, Henry." But opposition mounted. Southern Democrats, Wallace's civil rights stance threatened Jim Crow. Party bosses like Ed Flynn and Frank Walker saw him as unelectable, too radical for wartime unity. Foreign policy hawks worried about his Soviet softness amid emerging tensions. Internal clashes. Wallace had feuded with Jesse Jones over commerce policy. Alternatives emerged. James F. Burns, FDR's assistant president, but hated by Labor for his conservatism. William O. Douglas, young Supreme Court Justice, and Harry S. Truman, Senate investigator of war profiteering known for integrity. FDR's ambiguous play. Roosevelt was a master manipulator. He wrote a letter endorsing Wallace but added, "If I were a delegate, I'd vote for Henry." To bosses, he said he'd accept Truman or Douglas. It was classic FDR keeping options open. The convention opened with pro-Wallace fervor. Delegates chanted his name, but bosses worked the floor, promising patronage. The dramatic balloting. First ballot. Wallace leads with 429.5 votes. Majority needed 589. Truman trails at 319.5. Overnight, the machine kicks in. Chicago Mayor Ed Kelly delays proceedings. Bosses flip delegates. Second ballot, Truman pulls ahead, 1,031 to Wallace's 105. Wallace conceded gracefully. The future belongs to those who go down the line unswervingly for the liberal principles of both political democracy and economic democracy. He campaigned for FDR Truman, but the wound festered. In his diary, Wallace wrote, "The convention was a travesty on democracy." He believed conservative forces had stolen his destiny and America's progressive future. This resentment would explode after FDR's death. April 1945. Roosevelt's death and the Truman-Wallace rift. April 12, 1945. Warm Springs, Georgia. FDR suffers a massive cerebral hemorrhage and dies at 63. The nation mourns. The world shifts. Truman, sworn in that evening, inherits a war nearly won, but a peace fraught with peril. Wallace, still Commerce Secretary, attends the cabinet meeting. Publicly loyal, privately he laments, "If the convention had not been stolen from me, I would be president today." Truman's crash course in leadership. Harry S. Truman was the ultimate underdog, a failed haberdasher from Independence, Missouri, backed by the Pendergast machine, but honest to a fault. No college degree, no foreign policy experience. But he had grit, common sense, and a sign on his desk. "The buck stops here." Initially, Truman tried FDR's cooperative approach with Stalin. At Potsdam in July 1945, he met the Soviet leader, hoping for partnership. But red flags waved. Soviets installed puppet regimes in Poland, violating Yalta's free election pledge. Brutal occupations in Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary. Demands on Turkey and Iran. Division of Germany into zones with Soviet stripping factories. By 1946, Truman embraces George Kennan's long telegram. The USSR is expansionist. Contain it with firm resolve. Wallace's dissenting vision. Wallace clung to optimism. In memos and meetings, he argued, Soviet actions are defensive, born from 20 million WW2 dead and fear of encirclement. U.S. atomic monopoly, post-Hiroshima, provokes paranoia. Economic aid and diplomacy can build trust. Get tough policies will spark arms races. In a July 1946 letter to Truman, later leaked, Wallace warned, how we meet this issue will determine whether we live not in one world or two worlds, but whether we live at all. The clash was inevitable. Truman saw Stalin as a bully, Wallace as a misunderstood ally. September 1946, the Madison Square Garden bombshell and Wallace's firing, the stage was set for Wallace's defining moment. The speech that shook Washington. Sponsored by left-leaning groups, Wallace's address was a manifesto for peace. Getting tough never brought anything real and lasting, whether for schoolyard bullies or businessmen or world powers. The tougher we get, the tougher the Russians will get. We have no more business in the political affairs of Eastern Europe than Russia has in the political affairs of Latin America, Western Europe, and the United States. He called for atomic sharing under UN control and economic bridges. The crowd loved it, but Burns in Paris fumed. Soviets quoted Wallace to demand concessions. The approval debacle and fallout. Wallace had shown Truman the draft. The president said fine, but claimed he missed the contradictions. Press chaos ensued. Truman diary entry, Wallace's speech today, put the fat in the fire. Burns cabled, him or me. On September 20th, Truman fired Wallace, saying his views do not represent the policy of this government. Wallace responded defiantly, I shall continue to fight for peace. He was now a free agent, ready to rally the left. 1946 to 1947. Wallace's nationwide crusade against Truman's Cold War. Out of office, Wallace became a one-man opposition party. Platforms and tactics. Toured the US and Europe, drawing crowds with anti-war rhetoric. Became editor-at-large for the New Republic, writing pieces like The Path to Peace. Testified before Congress against military budgets. Organized the Progressive Citizens of America, PCA, a precursor to his party. Key attacks. On the Truman Doctrine, March 1947, $400 million aid to Greece/Turkey versus communists. This is not containment, it's encirclement. It's a program to arm reactionary governments. On the Marshall Plan, June 1947, $13 billion for European recovery. Noble in intent, but it's dividing Europe into blocs. Why exclude the Soviets? This is economic warfare. Wallace's appeal to war-weary vets, intellectuals and minorities. He drew 30,000 in LA, 20,000 in Chicago. Polls showed 15 to 20% support for his views. But critics, including ADA, Americans for Democratic Action, called him naive and lurking, communist influence in his circles. Truman ignored him publicly, focusing on policy wins like the National Security Act, creating CYA-DOD. 1948. The Progressive Party campaign, Idealism Meets Realpolitik. December 29, 1947. Wallace announces his run on the Progressive Party ticket. "I'm running to give voice to the millions who want peace," he says. The platform, bold and divisive. Foreign policy, end containment, negotiate directly with Stalin, ban atomic weapons, withdraw from bases. Domestic, fair deal on steroids. National health insurance, higher minimum wage, civil rights, including ending segregation in the military, which Truman later adopted. Public housing. It was visionary. The civil rights plank was stronger than either major parties, influenced the 1960s movement. Coalition of dreamers and infiltrators. Supporters included Hollywood stars Charlie Chaplin, musicians Pete Seeger, intellectuals Albert Einstein backed his peace efforts, and young activists. But the American Communist Party, CPUSA, saw opportunity. Loyal to Moscow, they volunteered en masse, organized in key states, and shaped anti-Truman messaging. Historical records, Venona decrypts, FBI files, show CPUSA leaders like William Z. Foster directing strategy. They raised funds, wrote speeches, and packed conventions. Wallace's stance on communists. Wallace refused to purge them. "I will not repudiate any support which comes to me on the basis of interest in peace." He saw anti-communism as McCarthyite hysteria, suppressing free speech. This was principled, but politically suicidal. Even allies like Reinhold Niebuhr warned, "You're being used." Truman hammered, "The Reds are running the progressives." To balance, not all progressives were communists, many were genuine liberals. But the association stuck, especially as HUAC hearings exposed Soviet spies. Campaign trail drama. Wallace barnstormed 30 states, facing eggs in the South for integrated events and cheers in the North. He predicted 10 million votes, forcing policy shifts. But reality bit. February 1948. The Czech coup, a reality check Wallace couldn't spin. February 20th to 25th, 1948. In Prague, communist ministers backed by Soviet tanks force out Democrats. President Beneš capitulates. Foreign Minister Jan Masaryk falls from a window. Murder ruled suicide. Czechoslovakia, a post-war democracy with communist coalition, falls to Stalinism. Free press shut. Opponents jailed. Impact on Wallace. This naked aggression shredded his defensive Soviets narrative. Czechoslovakia wasn't hostile. It had sought martial aid. Wallace's response. The change in Czechoslovakia was brought about by fear. Fear of the West rearming Germany. He blamed US policy. Voters recoiled. Liberal support evaporated. The new republic distanced itself, polls plummeted. November 1948, Election Day disaster and the Truman miracle. The race. Truman versus Dewey, GOP, Thurman, Dixiecrats, Wallace, Progressives. Pundits called it for Dewey, Democrats fractured. Results. Truman, 24.1 million votes, 49.6%, 303 EVS. Dewey, 22M, 45.1%, 189 EVs. Thurman, 1.2 million, 2.4%, 39 EVS. Wallace, 1.16 million, 2.4%, 0 EVS. Wallace won no states, barely beating Thurman in popular vote. His votes likely hurt Truman in close states like New York, but Truman's upset victory. Famous Dewey defeats Truman gaffe overshadowed it. Why the wipeout? Czech coup exposed Soviet brutality. Communist taint. Press dubbed it Henry Wallace's Red Party. Truman co-opted domestics, desegregated military, pushed fair deal. Foreign wins, Berlin airlift, June 1948 to May 1949, defied Soviet blockade, airlifting supplies to West Berlin. Symbol of resolve. No machine outside CPUSA organization was weak. Wallace was crushed. We fought the good fight, but his career was toast. 1950, the Korean War, final nail in Wallace's coffin. June 25th, 1950. North Korean troops, Soviet-equipped, crossed the 38th parallel, invading South Korea. Stalin approved, Mao aided. Truman's response: commits US/UN forces under MacArthur. Police action to contain communism. Wallace's evolution. Initially supports defense, saying aggression must be met, breaks with progressives who call it imperialism. Later, urges negotiations, criticizes escalation. Korea proved containment. Without pushback, communism spreads by force. Wallace's cooperation looked foolish. Wallace's later years, reflection, regret, and redemption. Post-1948, Wallace fades from politics. The 1952 admission. In This Week magazine, September 7, 1952, where I was wrong. I believed that the Soviet Union wanted peace, but the Korean War has shown me that the Soviet leaders are determined to achieve world domination. He condemned the Czech coup, admitted communist manipulation of his campaign. My greatest mistake was in not denouncing more vigorously the efforts of the communists to infiltrate. It was candid, rare for politicians. He blamed his over-optimism on wartime alliance euphoria. Quiet legacy. Wallace returned to Farview Farms, New York, breeding chickens and strawberries. He wrote books on agriculture, supported Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace. Died November 18, 1965, from ALS. Obituaries praised his New Deal work but noted foreign policy as his tragic flaw. Balanced view. Wallace's agricultural innovations fed the world. His civil rights advocacy predated the movement, but his Soviet naivety tarnished it all. The counterfactual. What if Wallace had been president? Suppose 1944 goes differently. Wallace stays VP, becomes president April 1945. Hypothetical policies. Post-Yalta accepts Soviet dominance in East Europe as sphere of influence. No Truman doctrine. Greece/Turkey fall to communists, opening Mediterranean. No Marshall Plan. Europe starves economically. Communist parties, strong in France/Italy, gain power. Atomic policy pushes early sharing, but Stalin, already spying via Rosenberg, accelerates bomb. Berlin yields to 1948 blockade, West Berlin falls. Korea hesitates, South overrun, emboldening Mao in Taiwan. Likely outcomes? Stalin, sensing weakness, pushes harder. Iran occupied, Scandinavia pressured, Western Europe destabilized, NATO never forms. Cold War? More like Soviet surge. But counterpoints, US economy booms anyway. Internal Soviet flaws, for example Stalin's paranoia, limit gains. Still, historians like John Lewis Gaddis argue containment was key to victory. Wallace might have excelled domestically, faster civil rights, healthcare, but foreign missteps could undo it. Ideology versus reality, Wallace's tragic flaw. Wallace's error. Assuming rational actors everywhere, quotes like "peace is a process," ignored Stalin's record, 30 million dead in purges, famines. Truman understood power. Carry a big stick, updated for nukes. Predictions. Wallace. Cooperation prevents expansion, reality, Soviets expanded anyway. Truman. Strength deters. Reality, airlift Korea checked them. Balance. Wallace's idealism inspired anti-war movements. His warnings on militarism echo in Vietnam debates. Lessons for America, sincerity, realism, and leadership. Wallace's story resonates today. Facing Russia, China, Do we engage or contain? He reminds us, sincerity without scrutiny is risky. Truman shows humble leaders can rise to greatness. Wallace lost everything but left a legacy of bold ideas. Truman saved the West. What ifs aside history's verdict, America chose wisely in 1944.